Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is, in fact, the Talamanca Review. And I wonder where the sweet spot is on this mic. Is it the front here? Yeah, it's the front. Um, and we're entering into what I would call the 11th hour of the globalist agenda. And I know I've been doing a lot of politics lately, but I'm hoping that you can see the interlay between the spiritual and the political. The spiritual always precedes the political. Okay, so periods of great change are always preceded by periods of what I would call um, spiritual absence. And by absence, I mean people are not living in consciousness. They're living in systems and programs and pathologies, and those would be the low-hanging fruit. The more severe things would be entity infestation and demonic possession. And it's really kind of everywhere you look now. And the reason it's everywhere you look now is because societies have a spiritual constitution, okay? And societies that don't have a spiritual constitution are generally murder factories, okay? Any society, and even if they do have a spiritual constitution, they can still be murder factories if they go left-hand path, if they go with the dark magics and the blood magic, like the Mayans, like certain European cultures, this subculture that we call Satanism. But I've been very consistent in what I've presented over the years and what's coming. And there are certain things in that dispensation which have not come about yet, but I fear that they're going to come about very soon. So I'll begin by talking about the new, I don't know, like what just happened in Canada, my home country, is kind of mind-boggling. Okay? It's just kind of mind-boggling. They basically created a prime minister. He was selected, not elected. Now, this was due to Justin Trudeau resigning. And he resigned because he was humiliated publicly by his finance minister and deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland. And then he just kind of hung around for a few more months to give us more platitudes and to commence the war of words and positional strategy of destroying Canada through the American insistence that we meet certain concessions in terms of border security and fentanyl. Now, whether you believe those things are exaggerated or not, and Trump is exaggerating, I don't think it really matters that much at this point. I think what matters is that Canada, in principle, has become a haven country for international criminal organizations. You could see this forming in the early 90s. I worked in a bar, a very kind of seedy bar, actually, in Vancouver before I went to Taiwan. I was there about a year after I graduated from university with my journalism degree. I graduated in a recession, and I took a job working at a bar. Very famous, actually. It's called the Marble Arch. It's actually in the Motley Crue song Girls, Girls, Girls. And the Marble Arch is where Tommy Lee met Pamela Anderson in Vancouver. Vancouver is like the seediest city I've ever lived in my life. It's just like a giant, I don't know how to describe it. Like the whole city is like a giant sewer, a giant brothel. It's just a very, very disgusting place. Physically beautiful, but very often physically beautiful places are very spiritually corrupt. It's very interesting the way this harmony works between things. And, you know, um, so what they did at the Liberal convention was they blocked 2/3 of the Liberal Party members from voting on the new leader. And the new leader all automatically assumes the prime ministership because there's no federal election between parties. It's an internal matter with the party. But there's still supposed to be a democratic process, and the democratic process is supposed to incorporate all of the delegates in the party. It is amazing the consistency with which the left is operating now. You see the same playbook, and it's not highly creative. Again, I keep saying that this force we're up against, it doesn't go beyond the astral. They're not that clever, and they have the same things they try over and over and over and over again, and they never quite work. They never quite work. And so this is a kind of shadow play, or a minor production of what happened with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Except if it were a 1-to-1 match, Trudeau would have resigned and recommended his deputy prime minister run for a federal election against the Conservatives. But that never would have washed, so they let it all be. And what they did was they brought in this dyed-in-the-wool inner circle, I'm just going to say it, piece of shit by the name of Mark Carney. He worked for Goldman. He's on the advisory. He's a major shareholder in a corporation called Brookfield, which is kind of, let's call it a lesser BlackRock, okay? And it's very insidious, the things that he's done. And more to the point, one of the things that Mark Carney has done, he did this in 2015. He was the governor of the Bank of Canada when we wrote our bail-in legislation. So bail-in legislation gives banks the right to seize your savings. Now, they don't own the savings. What they do is they convert your savings to stock in the bank. That's the Canadian model, and I assume that it goes all across the whole thing, you know? So yeah, it's just really quite something, I don't quite know what to make of it all. What's happening in Canada. But I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that the World Economic Forum has full control over Canada now, because Mark Carney is steeped in this organization, okay? Just absolutely steeped in it. And anyways, that's my opening salvo. And what I want to do now is I want to comment a little bit on what's going on in Europe, because it's the beginning of the bail-in. Okay, but they're doing it a very special way. Okay, so let's get into it.
Welcome back to World Affairs in Context, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. It does feel as though things are becoming more and more dystopian in a way, as the European Union is rearming and creating two separate funds worth nearly 8 billion euros for its militarization purposes. It recently announced what I would call an Orwellian plan. Frankly, I could not believe what I read. The European Union is actively exploring ways to use 10 trillion euros of citizens' savings. That's right, of citizen savings, private savings, and private investments, to be clear, for the EU defense/offense purposes.
Now, you'll notice this: the amount of private savings in both the United States and Europe now have come under the scrutiny of, let's just call it, interested eyes, private eyes, okay? It reared its ugly head in 2016 when Bernie Sanders suggested an inheritance tax was the way that he was going to pay for all his programs. And he blurted out that Americans at this time, and this is like 8 years ago, it's with inflation and everything, it's got to be a lot more. But in 2016, mid-2016, he said on the campaign trail that there were $67 trillion in savings in America. Now, these are people's private savings. This is just money sitting around in bank accounts, right? And these powers that be, they don't like idle money like that. They they don't like it. And so how does this all tie together? Well, let's just read the blurb here. European Commission to use 10 trillion euros of citizens' savings for EU defense. So the European Commission estimates the total level of unused savings of EU citizens at 10 trillion euros. And it intends to find ways to mobilize this money to finance its plans to militarize Europe and support the European military-industrial complex. According to a statement by European Commissioner for Financial Services and the Savings and Investment Union, Louis Albuquerque, distributed by the EC Press Services, TASS reports. Now, how they would legally do this is anybody's guess, but I don't think there is a way to do it legally. And here we are again, just like Bernie Sanders, although he had a semi-legal way of doing it, right? Distasteful to people who want to acquire private wealth in families, which I think is the whole point of a capital-based system, is that the money stay in the family, right? But not so much anymore. These aggressive inheritance taxes have invaded all of the G7 countries. Mind you, the powers that be themselves, they always leave backdoor loopholes for themselves so that they can escape the very taxes they put upon us. And this hypocrisy is one of the chief characteristics of the ruling elite. To truly gain the hearts and minds of a population, you have to walk among them. You have to live among them. It's kind of like when Henry V puts on a disguise in the great Shakespeare play and walks amongst the troops on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, where the English are outnumbered 5-1, and he listens to the concerns of his troops. And the next morning he delivers his harangue. And it's got to be one of the most stirring things in all of literature. We few, we happy few, right? And the British ended up winning the Battle of Agincourt through brilliant tactics and perseverance in battle. This situation in Europe is particularly alarming because it will set a trend for every other G7 country. But before we even get to that, because, to even have this conversation within the framework of legitimacy is ridiculous. There's nothing legitimate about taking 10 trillion in savings from 10 trillion euros. And who knew that Europe was so poor? I mean, the combined population of the European Union, well, let's look it up. I mean, that's, what we're doing here, right? On the internet. Let's see what it is. What is the population of the European Union? As of January 1st, 2024, the European Union had an estimated population of 449.2 million people. So that's about 100 million or 25% more than the United States. And yet in the United States, the estimated savings was 67 trillion in 2016, and in 2025, the estimated savings of the Europeans is 10 trillion euros. They're significantly poorer than Americans. Okay? And Europe, despite all its fancy architecture and beautiful old settings and everything, is a relatively poor place. I don't know how people get by there. I don't know how they eat in restaurants. I don't know how they do anything there, but they do. They somehow manage to do it, right? And so this is the situation. And to speak of it in terms of its illegitimacy, this is one of the faces that the bail-in will come in, right? So look, the way it works in government is the moment they speak about something, whether they speak about it through the passing of legislation, as they did in Canada when they brought the bail-in legislation uh, under Mark Carney in. Now, he was interviewed. He was vigorously interviewed by the Canada Broadcasting Corporation and by a number of established media outlets. And he said unequivocally, this will never, ever be used. This is just a stipulation of membership in the International Monetary Fund, the group of companies and state banks, national banks, which comprise the International Monetary Fund. And the stipulation came about as a result of what happened in Cyprus in 2014. I don't know how many of you remember Cyprus, but they had a banking failure there. And this bled into Greece, and there was that whole thing in Greece where people were committing suicide and all kinds of horrible things were happening. I'm sure you can remember all of that. It was about a decade, 11 years ago. And this is the umbrella or the shadow under which bail-in legislation was passed in Canada. Now, bail-in legislation is undoubtedly present in all of the EU member countries and in the EU in general. Okay? And the European Union, for all intents and purposes, is run by an unelected board. Okay? These people are not elected. And I just saw a really decent 2-hour interview between Clayton Morris of Redacted News and Tucker Carlson on the Tucker Carlson Network on his Spotify podcast. And um, I was astounded to find out how bad things are in Europe now, because Clayton and his wife Natalie Morris, who run Redacted, they live in Portugal now, and they're saying that when you live in an EU member state, the powers of the government are completely diminished, and everybody dances to the tune of whatever Brussels says. Now, that said, guaranteed every one of these countries has bail-in legislation. And I feel convinced that they will use some variant of the bail-in legislation to access the 10 trillion euros of citizen savings for EU defense. Now, there's an interesting moral dilemma here, okay? And it's very interesting because, look, we have become so entrenched with the idea of property in the West. Okay? And I'm not going all Klaus Schwab on you here. Okay? I'm not saying a world where you own nothing would be the world you are happiest in. Okay? I'm not saying that. But I am saying that it's impossible not to notice how sacrosanct the idea of property has become in the Western consciousness, especially the North American consciousness, which is why North America is being attacked so much, because that is the consciousness of private ownership. That is the consciousness, that is the mindset, that is the culture that has to be destroyed for the new system to be able to come into existence. You don't get to be the mob boss until you kill or dethrone the old mob boss. Sometimes it happens peacefully. The old mob boss gets RICO'd, ends up spending the rest of his life in prison, and dies in prison. Okay? Sometimes it goes that way. But generally speaking, when there's this succession of power, there has to be a very clear, how would you put it? A very clear, an explicit transfer of power. And it usually, in areas of high power, it can often involve some form of violence if it's unregulated power, not regulated by elections and things like this. Ergo, they're trying to knock out um, North America now. And to be honest, I mean, Canada's not even in the game anymore. I mean, they're basically just trying to knock out the United States now. Okay? And they were well on their way to doing it. I mean, had Harris and Waltz gotten in, it would be a done deal. And there would be radical measures brought into the American psyche to alleviate the idea of personal property. I mean, stop and think about the enormity of that task. What Klaus Schwab is proposing. You will own nothing. Let's forget about you will never have been happier. I don't know. That sounds like that Soma drug from Brave New World or something. Doesn't sound quite right to me. But nonetheless, let's leave that alone. You will own nothing. Well, how do you explain that to 350 million Americans? How do you explain that to Dana White, to Donald Trump, to Joe Rogan, to Andrew Tate, to all of the farmers who think that they own their 100 acres? How do you explain all that? Hey, you don't own anything anymore. Well, how does the new system work? Well, nobody knows because there has been no unveiling of the new system. It's like some creepy major launch at Apple or something. You're getting all the hype now about iOS 19. It is the biggest redesign of the iPhone interface since iOS 11 or 12, and we're on 18.3 now. Same sort of thing, it's just like all of this hype and marketing, but no substance. How are you going to create a society? How are you going to regulate a society where nobody owns anything? Well, I'll give you my opening salvo on this topic. I would say the cognitive impairments caused by the medical regimen are the first stage of it. Okay? So it may get to a point where that if you're not of the same mindset as the people who undoubtedly now, regrettably, followed the medical regimen, which has a number of, in my opinion, has a number of utilities and reasons for it. Now, this is just my opinion, and this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. I'm just some guy talking. I know I don't know anything. I'm just speculating on a hypothesis is all, okay? So entertainment reasons only. And I have to say this now. It's kind of like this little battle you have with the unseen auditors on some of the distribution platforms for podcasts. But I think that part of the agenda behind the vaccine was depopulation, and part of the agenda was a greater control over the consciousness of people who are able to live with the mutations caused by the medical regimen. And make no mistake about it, there are many, many mutations, okay? Now, it's also very slow acting, okay? So, by the way, it just popped into my head. Maybe that's what the EU will do is rewrite their inheritance law, and then they'll get that $10 trillion because they know a bunch of people are going to die. Okay. Now realize every government in power now that's in on this, and they're all in on it. Justin Trudeau was in on it. There's no way he actually got the vaccine himself. He's not stupid. Why would he do that? Why would he risk his health? Okay. So he didn't do that. And we know that there were massive exemptions for high-ranking officials in New Zealand. They were exempted from getting the vaccine. Okay? I accidentally said it there. This show is for entertainment only. It's my opinion only. So maybe that's one way that they're going to get the money is that they're just going to grab it when all these people die. You know? You can get really morbid thinking about these things all the time, and I find myself in a very political mindset these days. It just, I've done so many podcasts that are, let's say, elevated and instructive about how to live, what consciousness is, how it works. But there's this part of me that just likes to get down in the mud and get into the nitty-gritty politics of things, and albeit uniquely from my perspective, which, as some would rightfully say, if you're coming from a normative life perspective, you have every right to say, hey, that Bruce McDonald's a bit cynical. I would not take offense to that at all. Of course, I'm not cynical. I'm realistic. Okay? And this is what's going on now. And so this might be a way for them to access a lot of this money, is to just rewrite the inheritance laws. But who knows how it's going to go? Who knows? So you'll own nothing. And they want 10 trillion. So how do you get people to own nothing? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to take away what they already have. I mean, just follow it through sequentially. This is not rocket scientist. Take them at their face value. When the leader of the World Economic Forum says you're going to own nothing, which is basically communism, by the way, okay? So I've been saying this for years now. The two bookends on the political situation in the world are communism or Noahide law run from Jerusalem by sadistic, murderous, bloodthirsty rabbis. Okay? And either outcome results in more mass killing. Okay? Communism is mass killing. Communism, the Communist Manifesto, was written by Karl Marx, a very disturbed Jewish man. His own father in his diaries wrote, "I think my son is demonically possessed." Okay? Which is a fairly normal occurrence in the Hebraic world, by the way. Okay? Um, unfortunately, I don't think they've maintained the generational mastery of the demonic realms that Solomon had, and that they're very, very tricky forces to work with. In fact, it's just, it's like you want to get in and get out, when you're dealing in that world, and you don't want to break any of the rules. Okay? So you've got the mass murder of and the principal people that are murdered under Marxism, because it's an atheist system, they murder all the religious people. Okay? Now, this is code for non-Jewish religious people. Okay? Because that's what it's always code for. Do you really think that Karl Marx wanted to murder all the rabbis and murder Jewish culture because they're religious? Pull your head out of your ass. They basically, he was trying to legalize to start a movement for the mass murder of Christians. And when you look at the Bolshevik Revolution, the mass murdering took place mainly among the Christians. Okay, and the way they killed people was just it was a demon's ball. We're not talking about a bullet to the head here. They invented all these cruel games. They used to tie Eastern Orthodox priests to wooden poles, not tie them to wooden poles, but press them against the wooden poles, slit open their abdomens, and then have them run around the pole like, what do you call it, one of those paddle ball games, and their intestines would wrap around the pole, and they would disembowel themselves and fall over dead. And that was amusing to the communists, to the revolutionaries. Okay? And when you go over to the Abrahamic system, if we go that way, which is Noahide law run from Jerusalem, that will produce mass deaths related to idolatry. Okay? And the penalty for idolatry is death. You might get one warning when it comes in. And I know, look, this stuff sounds crazy. Oh, who is this guy? What's he talking about? This sounds completely crazy, Bruce. What are you talking about? Just look at the last 5 years and what's happened, and you tell me how crazy these ideas are. They're closer to reality than anything being spoken in the public space now. Okay? So you got the WEF, which Yuval Noah Harari, Klaus Schwab, largely. Uh, I'm going to stop saying Jewish. It's not fair to Torah Jews. I got to stop this, okay? It's basically Kabbalists and Masons. And then you go over to the Noahide law, and that will be run by Kabbalists and Talmudic rabbis, which are basically another version of Kabbalist. Wow, what a moon tonight. Looking right out the window there. another version of Kabbalist. Okay? So either way, it's mass murder, and the murder is being conducted by generally one group of people on the planet, and they seem to be very much aligned with this dark religion that seems to pop up everywhere, that likes the children, that likes the death rituals, that likes all of this stuff. Now, I don't know if I've ever said this on air before, and this is going to shock a number of you, but here goes. They have a right to exist. By the laws of free will, if that consciousness can form, take root, and be passed generationally, they have a right to exist. You know, when you're thinking about things or when you're perceiving things, try to suspend moral judgment, okay? And just look at the production of cultures the same way you would look at life forming in nature, okay? So we know that we know that yeah, had a bit of a power outage there. Just a flash power outage, but it knocked the computer out. So I'm back. That boy, totally talk about ruining the butterfly wings. So I don't even know. Oh yeah. So um they have a right to exist. And I know that sounds extremely disturbing to some people. And I don't really blame you for being disturbed by it, you know? Um but it is what it is. And when I look at the world, I look at everything that's going on and I ask myself, I don't look at it through a lens of good and evil. Okay? And really um where I'm at now in my development as an individual is I've definitely, I think, gone beyond the whole good and evil narrative. Now, that's just not to say that there isn't evil in the world. I mean, I've gone out of my way to document it. It's there. But I'm documenting it the way a nature photographer would document lions or something. I'm saying, hey, look, this exists, you know. You've never seen this part of the world before, what I'm showing you in The Light of Darkness, what I'm showing you in The Devil in Us, and even what I'm showing you in Stardust Ranch. It just is what it is, right? And so maybe they have a right to exist, is what I'm saying. And maybe they have a right to do what they're doing. Maybe there's a cosmic law when you get so far off track that the only solution is to kill people. Now, if that's true, and it might well be, okay? I'm not saying it is, but just work with me here, okay? It might well be true, okay? Now, if it's true, my only criticism would be that there are forces and groups in the world that are sort of deliberately leading us toward our own demise, you know? And when you, and here, I mean, just look at the last, let's say five and a half decades of North American culture, beginning in 1970. It's 55 years, right? I mean, look at what's happened in those 55 years. Look at all the things that we've normalized now. I mean, a lot of it becomes a lot of the work, a lot of the work they do in advancing their agenda is they perfect, and this is done by their meta psychology, and they're very smart. This is the sort of Mark Passio world of the satanic understanding of the unconscious and the true workings of consciousness. Whether you're enlightened or not, consciousness works the same way, whether you're enlightened or not. Becoming enlightened is the process of becoming conscious of how consciousness works. Okay? And so, but consciousness works the same whether you're enlightened or not. And it just comes down to whether you're ignorant to what's going on around you or whether you're cognizant of what's going on around you, including the invisible causative forces that bring societies to ruin. And, spoiler alert, they're always spiritual. Okay? Now, so there was that line that sort of haunted me from that interview I did about a year ago with Kat, where she said we really went off track and left the God path when we critically, academically, and scholastically endorsed Darwin and began to teach evolution. And with all my rumination on these dark topics, that had escaped me. And you can bet your bottom dollar that that's exactly what it is, because if Kat's saying it, it's from her knowledge of how they think and her long commiseration with those people. Okay? And then along with this theory of evolution, once you get this idea into people's heads. Now, before I go forward, I don't want to lose the people who have studied evolution and believe, although it's not a finished and absolute scientific theory, it's 95% done and has a lot of credibility, and only an idiot would disparage it, okay? And I don't want to be that idiot. So I'll briefly address evolution. Evolution is the process of the unconscious divine responding to the external environment. Okay, so when you get into lower species like insects that come and go, small mammals, reptiles, and things like this, those incarnations are governed by spiritual principalities that you could say that one soul animates a billion ants. Okay, and one soul could easily animate a billion ants, and the ants have a limited intelligence, and they operate off of the connection to this one piece of soul energy. Okay, or this individuated soul energy. And then as you come up into the human incarnations, you start to become individuated as a self-defined spiritual entity. Okay. So that's what evolution is. And I know that's not much of an answer for hardcore rationalists and scientists. I gave a consciousness answer for a scientific theory, but let me put it another way. When you look at the miracles that Christ performed, and I know I use it as my example because it's common knowledge. Okay? I could tell you about what some yogi did in 1921 that was filmed by National Geographic. But what does it matter? You don't know the yogi, you don't know that culture. So let's just stick with the Christ, okay? When you look at the ability of an individual human consciousness to transform the reality around it, water to wine, what have you, what you are seeing is that evolutionary principle contracted into a high consciousness that's incarnate. Okay? For most of us, manifesting things takes a lot longer because we're learning the process of manifestation. Christ was a spiritual master, so he had already mastered manifestation, so he could manifest instantly. Okay? Now that we call it a miracle, but it's supranatural, not supernatural, supra. Let me just see. I got to make sure my language is right there. What does supra mean? Supra for above is an academic and legal citation signal used when a writer desires to refer a reader to an earlier cited authority. Latin for above. For example, the author. Okay, that's the academic. Okay, so we can say it's supernatural, but the supernatural is an extension of the natural. The discordant consciousness that manifests aberrantly and in excess of the normal pattern of manifestation is preternatural, not unnatural. There's no such thing as unnatural. There's preternatural. Okay. Anyways, I'm kind of all over the place here now. I do apologize for that, but let's get back on track here. Okay.
Private investments, to be clear, for the EU defense/offense purposes. The European Union leadership has plans to use private capital. If you're in the European Union, this would be your savings. So they're going to use private capital for their military ambitions. Last week, I uploaded a video of Christine Lagarde announcing the launch of the digital euro, the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, that is planned for later this year. Make sure that you watch that video. I included a clip of her sharing the details where she shares the launch date. So my question then becomes, are they rolling out the central bank digital currency to assist with using private savings for military needs? Once the laws are passed, there's really not much that you can do as a citizen, as an individual, and a CBDC gives full control to the issuing entity, or in other words, the central bank or the government. So these are just my questions, but I think it is fair to ask these questions given the recent announcements. So there are several proposals on how the EU plan might actually work. One notable initiative came from Italy. As you can see here, the idea is very much sugar-coated to read mobilizing private savings. It involves Italy's proposal to leverage private capital for defense funding. Italy finance minister actually has
Let's just call that what it is. It's a military bail-in. They're stealing money. Now, the bail-in was written for bank failures. But given the situation with Russia, they're going to use. You see, this is the thing. This is why Carney was lying in 2015 when he passed it in Canada and he got grilled by the CBC, by CTV, by Global News, by all the big networks in Canada. And he stood there and he said, this will never be used. But we have to do it as a formality to maintain our membership with the IMF, with the World Bank, and with the Bank of International Settlements. Ergo, to stay in the SWIFT system, to stay in the global capital game, this is a new requirement as a result, and he kept citing this, as a result of what happened in Cyprus. But here we are now. The banks are not failing, but the government is going to usurp the private savings of citizens under the pretense of national defense. Now, there was a cycle of thought I didn't finish before. I do this all the time. I get so worked up, right? And my brain just starts going in a million and one different directions. But here's the ethical dilemma that I didn't close out 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago. Would you rather give up your savings to fight a war, or would you rather give 2 out of 5 sons in a family? Would you rather sacrifice the lives? Because the state has always had the right to mobilize for war. This is the oldest part of statesmanship. In fact, war is the main reason that countries exist. Okay? Countries come together to protect themselves against equal-sized numbers of people with equal or comparable levels of productivity. You can see this through the French-English wars, all through European history. You can see this in the Prussian Wars. You can see this in the Napoleonic Wars. And, I mean, granted, a lot of it was sort of Eurocentric, but if we turn our lens over to Asia, you will see all the same things going on inside of China. And China is an Asian Europe. It is a multitude of different ethnicities that all look Chinese to us, and different dialects, and different languages, and different provinces, and different traditions coming together to form an economic union. The way they did it in China was the Communist Revolution, okay? There was no other way to do it in China. But if you look at the 20th century, we've been aggregating and chunking regions of the world to massage us into this global government. And you know how I feel about global government. What global government will do, if they get it, they will be able to say to positive beings who want to help and mentor the human race, like Palladians, like Andromedans, like Arcturians, and this stuff's all real, by the way. It's all real, okay? Most of what we call the Abrahamic religion was actually a dispensation by the Palladians to advance human life on this planet, or the life that they seeded, which was the brown race, which is the Arabic race, including the Jews, the white race, which is the Europeans, and the red race, which is the global natives. I bet you didn't know that the natives are Palladian in origin, okay? And the reptilians came in, who had previously existed here, and through the astral and through various commiserations with the religious authorities entered into it by seducing the people with the power of black magic. Okay? Now, that's not to say that the Palladians and the other extraterrestrials didn't practice white magic. And the moment you practice one form of magic, you legitimize the other. This is why I say don't do magic. Okay? If I, if you're ever gonna have to fight with somebody, fight barehanded. Okay? Because the moment you bring weapons in, you just escalate it. Okay? And it used to, when I was growing up, you can get into a fight and you'd end up with a fat lip and a black eye, even if you won, and maybe a fractured or a sprained hand from punching somebody without your hand taped up like a boxer. Because it's not like the movies. I'll tell you right now, you learn to hit hard. You spend 1,000 hours on a heavy bag. Every time you hit someone on a street in a street fight, if you don't get them clean right on the jaw and break their jaw, if they tip their head at all and you hit the cheekbone or you hit the skull, you're going to sprain your hand. That's the way it goes. But then people started, now you can't even fight on the street anymore because it's all this like DEFCON 1 level of violence now. Everybody's got guns, knives, if you're in the UK. That's just ridiculous. And there was nothing wrong with getting things out of your system, you know? So here we are. So would you rather give up your sons and daughters now, because it's an egalitarian society? Would you rather give up 2 of your 5 children to conscription to go and fight and die in a war, like basically what Ukraine is doing? So Ukraine is paying in blood, okay? Russia is paying in blood, and the EU, because it doesn't want to confront its citizens with the grim reality of war, is going to mobilize through money. And this is going to legitimize the bail-in. Okay? Now, it's an interesting ethical dilemma. Is giving up your life savings worth it to keep 2 of your 4 children alive? I guess everybody just has to answer something like that on their own. Let's get back to this.
Outlined a plan to mobilize up to 200 billion euros in private investments for defense. He proposed for this amount to be backed by nearly 17 billion euro public guarantee. The only person who should be thinking about mobilizing private savings is the direct and legal owner of those savings. You would agree with that. However, anything appears to be possible these days in the European Union. Of course, after seizing and using the interest earned on Russian sovereign assets that are held in European central banks, anything is possible. And there is a legal explanation, legal loopholes that could be tailored to fit any sort of ambition, and this is just one of them. Imagine if these headlines came from Russia or from China or from any other unaligned state. They would be all over Western media. We wouldn't hear the end of them. But since this is the EU that is trying to use private savings and private investments for military needs, there's complete silence. It appears Italy's initiative has already received wide support from the EU finance ministers, so likely it will be implemented with some adjustments, I would expect. Reports indicate that finance ministers from Poland and France are on board. Italy's proposal actually complements the massive 8 billion euro defense fund announced by Ursula von der Leyen in early March.
Now, I just want to interject briefly. And this is in deference to and in honor of an ongoing email exchange I have with my friend Gregor, the Teutonic shaman, who lived in Finland for a decade, just south of the Arctic Circle, studying the ancient tradition he practices now. He has been persistently sending me articles and YouTube videos and trying to educate me on the danger of Russia. And look, I may have been flippant about this in past podcasts, but I would say flippant is not the right word. I would say I was advocating for isolation. European problems are not necessarily North American problems. If the EU can't defend itself against the legitimate threat of Russia, and I'm going to say it simply and clearly, okay? Russia is a threat, okay? It is a threat. I've been privy to some of their programming with English subtitles. Um, I mean, you would not believe what goes on national television in Russia, what they say. It would be it would be shameful for us to say these things even 30, 40 years ago. Like the xenophobia, the racism, the you know, they're definitely not down with this kumbaya global community, okay? And they do have designs, at least they're talking about it internally. They do have designs on re-expanding Russia, okay? So, where does this leave us with Donald Trump? Well, I would say that this is a sub-narrative. Now, it's a sub-narrative with a blood collateral. People are going to die. It's not to be dismissed. It's not to be overlooked. It's not to be. I'm not trying to desensitize you or myself from it. I mean, it's a legitimate thing. However, however, I think it could have been placated had we worked with Russia more and developed more economic cooperation with them and not isolated them. And I think one of the reasons that they were so isolated was because of the Jewish diaspora in the United States, which has a lot of, as um, Gonzalo Lira pointed out. Gonzalo Lira, he was the American podcaster who was basically murdered inside the Ukrainian jail system. Okay. And I liked Gonzalo Lira. I actually communicated with him off air on WhatsApp. I made a comment on his one of his videos, and he reached out to me directly through a direct communication on YouTube, and he gave me his WhatsApp number, and I texted with him for a while. He's a smart guy, and he was telling the truth. And what he was saying was that, look, basically what I'm saying tonight, like, yeah, Russia is, we all know what Russia is. But why would you not try to work with it and try to bring it into the modern world, and rather than isolate and humiliate and seek to ultimately destroy them, which is what the State Department under Victoria Nuland was trying to do. And as Gonzalo Lira pointed out, an inordinate number of people in the Russia desk at the U.S. State Department were the grandchildren of Russian Jews who suffered under the Russian pogroms against the Jews. And the Russians were intensely anti-Semitic, as is I suspect, the Eastern Orthodox Church. It would be the source of it, okay? And this is real anti-Semitism, okay? So, but I would say to that, again, then what happens is you fall back to the default consciousness of the Jew, which is blood libel, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I think that's ridiculous. And I think that ideology was allowed to seep into the American State Department under the auspices of some form of national interest and neutrality masquerading as Jewish blood libel through Victoria Nuland and her cohorts is part of the problem. And then at the same time, you've got Putin, who now has extraordinary relationships with the Chabad community inside of Russia. Okay? And there are all kinds of Russian Jewish oligarchs. In fact, I would say disproportionately, the ethnicity of the Russian billionaire is usually Jewish. They're Russian. They speak Russian. They go through the Russian school system. They've lived in Russia for generations, so we can say they're Russian, but they're Russian Jews. Okay? This is what's going on. So the reason I stopped and I just wanted to briefly address this was because, look, you got to take note of the fact that, like, Meloni is sort of a Trump type Italian leader, but she endorses seizing private savings accounts to militarize against Russia. That should tell you something. Poland is against the diminution of its ethnic purity through mass migration. They're fighting the globalist order every way they can. And yet they're also in favor of beefing up defense against the Russians. And what does this tell you? Well, the more I think about it, and as I'm thinking about it right now and speaking it out loud, would it not be a plausible theory that Vladimir Putin and Russia are agents of the WEF at this point? They're like the sheepdog at the far end of the herd, trying to, through barking and intimidation, trying to bring everybody into line. And this, make no mistake about it, this will ultimately be achieved with violence. Okay? And so much of the global resource has been invested in this plan. I mean, how many leaders do you see going against the Great Reset right now? Canada's in on it. Half of the United States is in on it, whether they realize it or not. I mean, if you voted for Harris and Walz, you're in on the global reset, which is global communism, CBDC, a whole new way of organizing human beings. Okay, no personal freedom, mandatory medical regimens, mandatory undeclared depopulation events, which would be happening every 15, 20, 25 years. This is the new norm for managing the human herd, the human population. And of course, within this new system, elites will form. And these elites will be organizational minds like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the Russian oligarchs and the Chinese oligarchs. You know, the Chinese Communist Party has over 1,500 billionaires in US dollars. Did you know that? Do you know that China has more billionaires than any other country in the world? And they all very coincidentally, they all seem to be associated with government. And so here we haven't even gone to global communism yet, and the hypocrisy's all already there. So this isn't even communism. This isn't even a workers' revolution. I don't even know what to call this anymore. It's like a creeping autocracy, you know? Anyways, I think that's about enough for tonight. I'm not sure I made my point. I don't have time to finish this whole video, but you get the point, okay? We're in dire straits here, okay? And I don't know what Trump's going to do. You know, I don't know how he'll be able to stave this off because it seems like Europe and everybody is going in its own direction now. And Canada is going to join the European Union under Carney. And that's going to completely... the United States is going to be isolated in the same way Adolf Hitler was at the beginning of World War III. Okay? That's how it's going to be. Anyways, I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been... Let me sign off on my main screen here. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review.